The radio crackled at 13:47 hours with the kind of static that makes every controller's blood run cold. Colonel Martinez pressed his headset tighter against his ear, watching the green blip that represented call sign Viper 7 disappear from his screen like smoke dissolving into wind. The last transmission had been garbled, something about surface-to-air missiles and smoke in the cockpit, then nothing but the endless hiss of dead air that haunted every military communications officer's nightmares. Viper 7, this is Tower Control, please respond, Martinez repeated into his microphone, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. The other controllers in the room had gone quiet, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they watched him work. Outside the tower windows, the afternoon sun painted the runway in golden streaks, but inside, the atmosphere had turned thick with dread. Captain Reyna, Viper, Castellanos had taken off 2 hours earlier in her A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Viper 7, on what should have been a routine close air support mission over the disputed territory. The intelligence reports had indicated light resistance, maybe a few small arms, nothing that would challenge an experienced pilot in a plane built to take punishment. But intelligence reports, as every veteran knew, were about as reliable as weather forecasts in tornado season. The A-10, affectionately known as the Warthog, was not a pretty aircraft. Built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed its spine, it looked more like a flying bathtub than a fighter jet. Its twin engines sat high on the fuselage, its landing gear was fixed and ungainly, and its titanium bathtub cockpit made it look like it had been assembled from spare parts in someone's garage. But it was tough, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying when sleeker jets would have been twisted metal scattered across the landscape. Martinez had watched hundreds of pilots take off in A-10s over his 23-year career, but there was something different about Castellanos. Maybe it was the way she walked to her aircraft with the kind of confidence that came from surviving when others hadn't, or maybe it was the small ritual she performed before every flight, touching the faded photograph taped to her instrument panel before strapping in. The other pilots called her Ice Queen behind her back, not out of malice, but because she had a reputation for keeping her cool when the world was exploding around her. Now that same world had apparently swallowed her whole, leaving nothing but silence and the growing certainty that another good pilot had been claimed by a war that seemed to devour everything it touched. Martinez stared at his radar screen, willing that green dot to reappear, knowing it wouldn't. 3 minutes stretched into 5, then 10. The silence grew heavier with each passing second, pressing down on the tower like a physical weight. Martinez had already begun composing the casualty report in his mind when Airman Foster, monitoring the emergency frequency, suddenly straightened in his chair like he'd been struck by lightning. "Sir," Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm getting something on guard frequency. It's weak, but—" He adjusted his equipment, fine-tuning the signal with practiced precision. The static cleared for just a moment, and through the electronic hiss came a voice, faint but unmistakably human. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper 7, requesting emergency landing clearance. I'm coming home on a wing and a prayer, and right now I'm not sure which one's working." The voice belonged to Castellanos, but it sounded different somehow, strained and tight with pain. Martinez felt his heart skip a beat as he grabbed his microphone. "Viper 7, Tower Control, we have you on radio. What's your status?" The response came through layers of static and interference, each word fought for and won against the electronic storm in her radio. "Tower, I've got battle damage to the starboard engine. Hydraulics are shot to hell, and I think I'm flying on pure stubbornness at this point. But I'm about 15 clicks out and coming in hot." Every person in the tower turned to look out the windows, searching the sky for any sign of the returning aircraft. The afternoon was clear, visibility unlimited, but the horizon remained empty except for a few scattered clouds that looked like cotton balls against the blue. Martinez coordinated with the crash crews, alerting medical personnel and fire suppression teams, while other controllers cleared the airspace and prepared for an emergency landing. Then someone spotted it, a dark speck against the western sky, trailing a thin line of black smoke like a pencil mark drawn across blue paper. As it grew larger, the unmistakable silhouette of the A-10 became visible, but something was wrong with its profile. The aircraft was flying at an odd angle, one wing lower than the other, and the smoke trail was growing thicker by the second. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered Controller Adams, a 20-year veteran who had seen his share of emergency landings. "Look at that thing. It's barely holding together." The A-10 was indeed a mess. Even from several miles away, they could see that the right engine nacelle was blackened and twisted. The vertical stabilizer was riddled with holes, and there were jagged tears in the fuselage that looked like they'd been made by very large, very angry claws. But somehow, impossibly, the aircraft was still flying, still responding to its pilot's commands, still carrying her home against all odds and several laws of physics. Martinez keyed his microphone again. "Viper 7, we have the field in sight. Emergency crews are standing by. Can you give us more details on your condition?" Castellano's voice came back stronger this time, though there was an edge to it that spoke of pain being held in check by sheer willpower. "Tower, let's just say this bird won't be winning any beauty contests. I've got minimal control authority. The right engine is more decoration than propulsion at this point, and I'm pretty sure I'm leaking something important. But the big gun still works, and that's what counts." There was something in her tone, a dark humor that military pilots use to mask fear and uncertainty. It was the voice of someone who had looked death in the eye and decided to schedule the meeting for another time. Martinez had heard that tone before, usually from pilots who were closer to disaster than they wanted to admit but were too proud or too stubborn to let it show. The A-10 continued its approach, growing larger and more damaged-looking with each passing second. The smoke trail had become a thick black stream, and Martinez could swear he could see flames licking around the right engine housing. The aircraft was flying lower and slower than normal, its pilot fighting to maintain altitude and airspeed with an airplane that clearly wanted to fall out of the sky and take up permanent residence in the ground. As the Warthog passed over the runway threshold, Martinez got his first clear look at the extent of the battle damage, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The right engine was completely destroyed, its housing peeled back like a flower that had bloomed in reverse. The fuselage was stitched with holes from nose to tail, some small enough to be bullet holes, others large enough to crawl through. The right wing looked like it had been used for target practice by an artillery battery, and Martinez could actually see daylight through several spots in the aircraft's skin. But somehow, impossibly, the A-10 was still flying, still responding to Castellano's commands, still carrying her toward the safety of the runway with the kind of stubborn determination that had made the aircraft legendary among close air support pilots. It was a testament to both the ruggedness of the machine and the skill of the pilot flying it. The landing gear came down with visible difficulty, the right main gear extending at an odd angle that suggested significant structural damage. Castellanos lined up on final approach, her aircraft wallowing through the air like a wounded bird, black smoke streaming behind her like a funeral shroud. Every person in the tower held their breath as the battered A-10 descended toward the runway, knowing they were witnessing either a miraculous save or a spectacular disaster. The wheels touched down hard, much harder than normal, and the aircraft bounced once before settling onto the concrete with a screech of tortured metal. Sparks flew from the right main gear, and for a moment it looked like the landing gear might collapse entirely, sending the A-10 sliding down the runway in a shower of sparks and twisted aluminum. But the gear held barely, and the aircraft rolled out straight and true despite everything that was wrong with it. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the smoking Warthog as it slowed, their red and blue lights flashing against the afternoon sun. Foam trucks and ambulances converged on the aircraft as it finally came to a stop, still trailing smoke, and looking like it had been through a blender set on obliterate. The canopy popped open with a hiss of pressurized air, and Captain Reina Castellanos emerged from the cockpit like a phoenix rising from ashes. She was covered in hydraulic fluid and what looked suspiciously like blood, her flight suit torn in several places, her helmet cracked down one side. But she was alive, conscious, and apparently able to move under her own power. Martinez watched from the tower as Castellanos climbed down from her aircraft, waving off the medics who rushed toward her. She turned to look back at her battered, reaching out to pat the fuselage with something approaching affection. It was a gesture that spoke of a bond between pilot and machine, forged in combat and tempered by survival against impossible odds. Viper 7 is down safe, Martinez announced over the radio, his voice betraying more emotion than he'd intended. Aircraft is code 3, pilot appears to be walking wounded. But even as he spoke the words, Martinez knew that what he had just witnessed was more than a successful emergency landing. It was a story that would be told and retold in ready rooms and briefing halls for years to come, a tale of skill, courage, and the kind of determination that turned ordinary people into legends. Captain Reina Castellanos had just proved that sometimes, when everything goes wrong and the world seems determined to kill you, the only appropriate response is to flip it off and fly home anyway. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone watching that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, including 5'4" female pilots who refuse to quit even when their airplane is falling apart around them. The debriefing would come later, along with the incident reports, damage assessments, and probably a few medals. But for now, Martinez was content to watch as the medical team finally convinced Castellanos to let them examine her injuries, and the fire suppression crews worked to extinguish the last wisps of smoke rising from the destroyed engine. It had been, he reflected, one hell of a day, and it wasn't over yet. The debriefing room smelled of stale coffee and the particular brand of exhaustion that came from too many missions and not enough sleep. Captain Castellanos sat at the metal table, her flight suit replaced by hospital scrubs, white bandages covering the worst of her cuts and abrasions. Her left arm was in a sling, and there was a butterfly bandage over her right eyebrow, but her eyes were sharp and alert as she faced the panel of officers who had gathered to hear her story. Colonel Martinez sat at the head of the table, flanked by the wing commander, the intelligence officer, and the squadron commander. All four men wore expressions of professional interest mixed with barely concealed amazement. The preliminary damage assessment of Castellanos, A-10, had revealed the extent of what she had survived, and the numbers were staggering. "Let's start from the beginning," Martinez said, his voice gentle but official. "You departed at 11:47 hours for a routine CAS mission in Grid Square Echo 7. Walk us through what happened." Castellanos nodded, taking a sip of water before beginning her narrative. Her voice was steady, professional, the voice of a pilot who had learned to compartmentalize trauma and focus on facts. Initial approach was normal, no unusual radio chatter, no signs of enhanced air defense activity. Intelligence package indicated light resistance, small arms only. I was cleared to provide close air support for a ground unit that had encountered enemy contact. She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the bandage over her eyebrow. First pass was textbook. Laid down suppressing fire with the gun, enemy positions went quiet. Ground unit reported all clear, requested one more pass to make sure. "That's when things went sideways," she continued, her voice dropping slightly. "Second pass, I'm coming in from the north, same altitude, same approach angle. Suddenly my RWR lights up like a Christmas tree. Surface-to-air missile launch, multiple bogeys, tracking me from 2 o'clock. The intelligence officer leaned forward, his pen poised over a yellow legal pad. "Sams, that wasn't in the intelligence package. What type? How many?" "SA-7s, maybe SA-14s. Hard to tell when you're trying not to die," Castellanos replied with a dry humor that didn't quite hide the tension in her voice. At least 3 launches that I could confirm visually. First one missed, went stupid, and chased a flare. Second one, she gestured at her bandaged arm. Second one got intimate with my starboard engine. Martinez studied the damage photographs spread across the table. The images showed an engine nacelle that looked like it had been chewed up by something with very large teeth, then spit out in disgust. How did you maintain control with that kind of damage? Honestly, stubbornness and luck in roughly equal proportions. Castellanos allowed herself a small smile. The A-10 is built to take punishment, and she took it like a champ. Lost all hydraulic pressure on the right side. Most of my engine instruments went dark, but the primary flight controls were still responding. Sort of. She reached for her water glass again, her hand steady despite everything she'd been through. Thing is, when that missile hit, it didn't just take out the engine. Shrapnel went everywhere. Punctured my fuel tanks, severed some control cables, took out most of my radio equipment. I was flying a very expensive paperweight held together with cable ties and pilot determination. The wing commander, a graying colonel named Harrison who had flown A-10s in the Gulf War, shook his head in amazement. "Captain, I've seen the damage reports. By all rights, that aircraft should have been unflyable. The fact that you not only kept it in the air but managed to bring it home." He trailed off, searching for words that seemed inadequate to the task. "Sir, with respect, that's what we train for," Castellanos replied matter-of-factly. "Bad day at the office, but still a day at the office. Besides," she added with a grin that was pure pilot bravado, "I wasn't about to let those bastards have the satisfaction of knowing they got me." The intelligence officer looked up from his notes. "Captain, you mentioned multiple missile launches. What happened to the third one?" Castellanos' expression grew darker, the humor fading from her eyes. "That one was the problem child. Tracking true, coming in from my 6 o'clock low, and I was out of flares. Engine was on fire, hydraulics were gone, and I was flying straight and level like a training target." She paused, staring at something only she could see. "So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned into it." The room went dead silent. Every pilot in the room understood the implications of what she had just said. Turning into a heat-seeking missile was a tactic so dangerous it bordered on suicidal, requiring split-second timing and nerves of absolute steel. "You turned into a SAM with a damaged aircraft," Martinez said slowly, as if he needed to hear the words to believe them. "And survived." "Barely," Castellanos admitted. "Waited until the last possible second, then pulled the hardest right turn I could manage with what was left of my control authority. Missile went ballistic, overshot, and took out a small mountain instead of me. But the G-force from that turn," she gestured at her bandaged arm, "let's just say it wasn't gentle on the pilot." Colonel Harrison was shaking his head in disbelief. "Captain, what you're describing is textbook impossible. A damaged A-10 doesn't have the performance envelope to execute that kind of maneuver." "Tell that to the A-10, Castellanos replied with a shrug. "She might be ugly, but she's tough as nails. We've been flying together for 3 years and she's never let me down. Wasn't about to start today." There was something in her tone, an affection for her aircraft that went beyond the professional relationship between pilot and machine. It was the kind of bond that developed between warriors who had faced death together and lived to tell about it. The debriefing continued for another hour, covering every detail of the mission, the engagement, and the emergency landing. But even as they discussed tactical implications and lessons learned, everyone in the room understood that they had just heard something special. This wasn't just a successful emergency landing or a lucky escape from enemy fire. This was the story of a pilot who had looked impossible odds in the eye, smiled, and flown home anyway. And in a profession where heroes were made from such moments, Captain Reina Castellanos had just written herself into legend. Word of Viper 7's miraculous return spread through the base like wildfire. carried on the invisible network of gossip, speculation, and grudging admiration that connected every military installation. By evening chow, there wasn't a soul on base who hadn't heard some version of the story, and with each telling, the details grew more dramatic and the hero more heroic. In the enlisted mess hall, Sergeant First Class Dakota Rivers set down his coffee cup and fixed his audience with the kind of stare that demanded attention. Rivers had been around long enough to know bullshit from reality, and his reputation for straight talk made him a reliable narrator in a world full of tall tailies. "I'm telling you, I was right there on the flight line when that A-10 came in," he said, his voice carrying the authority of an eyewitness. "Looked like it had been through a damn food processor. Smoking, sparking, making noises that would make a mechanic cry." Private Martinez, fresh out of basic training and still wide-eyed about military aviation, leaned forward eagerly. "What about the pilot? What's she like?" Rivers considered the question carefully. He had worked on Castellano's aircraft before, had watched her pre-flight inspections and post-flight debriefs. Unlike some pilots who treated their ground crews like furniture, she knew every mechanic's name and always took time to listen to their concerns about her aircraft. "Ice Queen, that's what they call her," Rivers said slowly. "Not because she's cold, but because nothing seems to rattle her. I've seen pilots come back from easy missions shaking like leaves, but Castellano's, she climbs out of that shot-up bird like she's getting out of a taxi after a trip to the grocery store." The younger airmen around the table absorbed this information with the reverence reserved for legendary figures. In a military culture built on stories of heroism and sacrifice, Captain Reina Castellanos was rapidly becoming the stuff of legend. But not everyone was ready to embrace the narrative quite so enthusiastically. In the officers' club, the mood was more subdued, more analytical. Major Thompson, a fighter pilot with F-16 experience and a reputation for aggressive flying, nursed his beer and listened to the conversations swirling around him with growing skepticism. "Look, I'm not saying she didn't do good work out there," Thompson said when pressed for his opinion. "Emergency landings are never easy, especially with battle damage, but let's not get carried away here. She flew a damaged plane home. That's what pilots do." Captain Williams, a fellow A-10 driver, bristled slightly at the dismissive tone. "Jack, have you seen the damage reports? That aircraft was held together with prayer and stubbornness. The fact that it was even flyable is miraculous." "Miraculous?" Thompson scoffed. "Come on. The A-10 is built to take punishment. That's the whole point of the aircraft. And Castellanos has been flying them for what, 3 years? She should know how to handle emergency procedures." Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, the squadron operations officer, had been listening to the conversation with growing irritation. He'd been flying A-10s for 15 years, had seen combat in 3 different theaters, and knew exactly how difficult what Castellanos had accomplished really was. "Major Thompson," Peterson said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made conversation stop mid-sentence, "with all due respect, you have no idea what you're talking about. I've read the preliminary damage assessment. That aircraft had multiple engine failures, hydraulic system compromise, flight control damage, and communications equipment destruction. The fact that Captain Castellanos not only maintained control, but executed a successful landing approach in those conditions represents flying skill of the highest order." The room had gone quiet, other conversations dying, as officers turned to listen to what was shaping up to be a professional disagreement between senior pilots. Thompson, to his credit, didn't back down, but his tone became more respectful. "Sir, I'm not questioning her technical skills. I'm just saying we might be making this out to be bigger than it actually is. Good pilots handle emergencies. That's what separates the professionals from the wannabes." Peterson nodded slowly, acknowledging the point while clearly disagreeing with the conclusion. "You're right that good pilots handle emergencies, But what Captain Castellanos did today went well beyond handling an emergency. She took an aircraft that should have been unflyable and brought it home safely through a combination of skill, courage, and determination that frankly borders on the miraculous. He paused, taking a sip of his own beer before continuing. I've been flying warthogs for 15 years, Major. I've seen what battle damage can do to these aircraft, and I've seen good pilots die trying to do exactly what she did today. The fact that she not only survived, but landed that airplane safely is something special. The conversation continued, but the tone had shifted. Even Thompson seemed to recognize that he was arguing against a tide of professional opinion that viewed Castellanos' achievement as genuinely extraordinary. Around the club, other conversations had resumed, but they all seemed to center on the same topic: the pilot who had refused to quit when quitting would have been perfectly understandable. Back in her quarters, Captain Reina Castellanos sat on her narrow military-issue bed, staring at a photograph that had seen better days. The image showed a younger version of herself standing next to an older man in an Air Force uniform, both of them smiling at the camera with the kind of easy familiarity that spoke of deep affection. The man was her father, Master Sergeant Eduardo Castellanos, who had spent 26 years maintaining A-10s before retiring to a small ranch in Texas. He had been the one who first told her stories about the warthog, who had explained how the ugly duckling of military aviation had earned the respect and love of pilots and ground crews alike through sheer, stubborn competence. Mija, he had told her during her pilot training, using the Spanish endearment that always made her smile, the A-10 isn't the prettiest bird in the sky and she's not the fastest. But when the world goes to hell and everyone else is heading for the exits, she'll bring you home. You just have to trust her. Today, she had trusted the aircraft her father had spent a career maintaining, and it had indeed brought her home. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now flying the same type of aircraft her father had spent years fixing, and that his knowledge and love for the warthog had somehow been passed down to help save her life. She touched the photograph gently, remembering the pride in his voice when she had earned her wings, the way he had insisted on being there for her first solo flight in the A-10. He would have been proud of today's flight, she knew, not because of the heroics or the drama, but because she had demonstrated the fundamental truth he had always preached: take care of your aircraft, and it will take care of you. Her phone buzzed with a text message, probably another well-wisher or colleague checking on her condition. The messages had been coming in steadily since word of the incident had spread, everything from formal inquiries about her health to casual notes from friends expressing amazement at her survival. But this message was different. It was from her father and it was characteristically brief. Heard about your day at work. The bird okay? She smiled, typing back. Bird's pretty banged up, but she'll fly again. Pilot's fine too, in case you were wondering. His response came back immediately. Never worried about the pilot. Castellanos' women are too stubborn to die in airplane crashes, but I spent 26 years keeping those birds in the air. Hate to see one get hurt. It was so perfectly her father that she laughed out loud, a sound that felt strange after the day she'd had. Even in the face of his daughter's brush with death, Eduardo Castellanos was more concerned about the welfare of the aircraft. It was a priority system that might seem backwards to civilians, but made perfect sense to anyone who understood the symbiotic relationship between military pilots and their machines. She was about to respond when another message appeared, this one from Lieutenant Colonel Peterson. Captain, need to see you in my office first thing tomorrow. Bring coffee. We have some things to discuss. Castellanos stared at the message, wondering what kind of things her squadron commander wanted to discuss. In her experience, early morning meetings with senior officers usually meant one of two things: very good news or very bad news, with little middle ground between the extremes. Given the events of the day, it could go either way. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson's office reflected the personality of a career military officer who had learned to find comfort in organization and efficiency. Awards and commendations lined one wall, while the opposite side displayed photographs from various deployments and squadron activities. His desk was immaculate, everything in its proper place, from the perfectly aligned pen set to the small American flag that stood at attention in the corner. Captain Castellanos knocked precisely at 800 hours, carrying 2 cups of coffee as requested. Peterson looked up from a stack of papers, gestured for her to enter, and accepted the coffee with a nod of appreciation. "Sit down, Captain," he said, his tone unreadable. "We need to talk." Castellanos took the chair across from his desk, maintaining the proper military bearing despite the fact that every muscle in her body ached from the previous day's ordeal. She had been up since 5:30, partly from habit and partly because sleep had proven elusive when every time she closed her eyes, she saw surface-to-air missiles tracking toward her aircraft. Peterson studied her for a moment, nodding the way she held herself despite her obvious discomfort, the alertness in her eyes despite what had to be exhaustion. He had read her file thoroughly the night before, preparing for this conversation, and what he had found there painted a picture of a pilot who had been consistently underestimated throughout her career. "First things first," he began, "how are you feeling? And don't give me the standard military response. I need to know if you're fit for duty." Castellanos considered the question carefully. Military culture discouraged admitting weakness, but Peterson's tone suggested he was looking for honesty rather than bravado. "Sir, I'm sore as hell and probably running on adrenaline and caffeine, but I'm functional. The flight surgeon cleared me for light duty, and I don't have any issues that would affect my ability to fly." "Good," Peterson nodded, "because I'm going to need you back in the cockpit sooner than you might expect." He leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction. "The preliminary investigation into yesterday's incident has raised some questions that need answers, and you're the only one who can provide them." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer, spreading several photographs across the surface between them. The images showed the aftermath of what had clearly been a significant military engagement: destroyed vehicles, cratered terrain, and the unmistakable signs of close air support operations. "These photos were taken this morning by a reconnaissance team sent to investigate the site of your engagement," Peterson explained. "What they found was unexpected." Castellanos leaned forward to examine the photographs, her professional training automatically analyzing the tactical situation they depicted. What she saw made her eyes widen slightly in surprise. "Sir, that's not possible," she said quietly, pointing to one particular image. "This shows at least 12 destroyed enemy vehicles, including what looks like 2 mobile SAM systems, but I was only cleared for close air support against infantry positions." "That's exactly the problem," Peterson replied grimly. "According to the intelligence package you received, you were supporting our ground forces against a light enemy patrol. No vehicles, no air defense systems, no significant military assets." He tapped another photograph. "This looks more like you stumbled into a major enemy staging area." The implications hit Castellanos immediately. If the intelligence had been wrong about the nature of the enemy force, it raised serious questions about how such a significant error could have occurred. More importantly, it suggested that her mission had been far more dangerous than anyone had realized, and that her survival was even more remarkable than initially thought. "Sir, are you suggesting that I was sent into a trap?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Peterson replied. "But I am saying that what you accomplished yesterday was significantly more impressive than we initially understood. According to these reconnaissance reports, you didn't just survive a surface-to-air missile attack and bring home a damaged aircraft. You single-handedly destroyed a major enemy formation that could have caused serious problems for our ground forces." He pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Wing Headquarters. "Captain, I've been instructed to inform you that your actions yesterday are being reviewed for possible recognition. The preliminary recommendation is for the Distinguished Flying Cross." Castellanos felt her breath catch. The DFC was one of the highest awards for aerial achievement, reserved for pilots who had demonstrated extraordinary heroism in flight operations. It was not the kind of recognition given lightly, and it represented validation from the highest levels of military leadership. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said, the response automatic and ingrained by years of military training. "No, Captain, you were doing everyone else's job too," Peterson replied with a slight smile. "The ground forces you were supporting reported that after your engagement, enemy resistance in their sector collapsed entirely. What you thought was a routine close air support mission turned out to be a decisive engagement that eliminated a significant threat." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "But here's what concerns me. The intelligence failure that put you in that situation was significant enough to suggest either incompetence or something more troubling. I need you to walk me through every detail of that mission again, because there are questions that need answers." For the next hour, Castellanos recounted her mission in exhaustive detail, from the pre-flight briefing to the moment she shut down her engines after landing. Peterson took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or elaboration on specific points. What emerged was a picture of a pilot who had faced a situation far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated, and who had responded with skill, courage, and determination that had turned a potential disaster into a significant tactical victory. "Captain," Peterson said finally, closing his notebook, "I want you to understand something. What you did yesterday wasn't just good flying. It was the kind of performance that defines careers and saves lives. The fact that you're sitting here having this conversation instead of being listed as a casualty is a testament to your skill as a pilot and your character as an officer." He stood up, extending his hand across the desk. "I'm proud to have you in my squadron, and I'm going to make damn sure that everyone up the chain of command understands exactly what kind of pilot we have in Captain Reina Castellanos." As she left Peterson's office, Castellanos felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride at the recognition, certainly, but also a growing awareness that yesterday's mission had changed something fundamental about how others perceived her. For the first time in her career, she was being judged not on preconceptions or assumptions, but purely on performance under pressure. It was, she reflected, about damn time. News of the DFC recommendation spread through the wing faster than a brush fire in drought season, carried on the same informal communication network that had already transformed Captain Castellanos from a competent pilot into something approaching a legend. But with recognition came scrutiny, and not all of it was positive. Major Jack Thompson sat in the briefing room, listening to the mission debrief with growing frustration. As the slides clicked through the tactical analysis of Castellanos' engagement, each new detail seemed to add another layer to what was already being called one of the most successful single-aircraft missions of the deployment. 12 enemy vehicles destroyed, 2 mobile SAM systems eliminated, an entire enemy formation neutralized by one A-10 in a single attack run. The numbers were impressive, undeniably so, but Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that the whole situation was being blown out of proportion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the intelligence officer was saying, "what Captain Castellanos accomplished represents a textbook example of close air support operations executed under the most adverse conditions. Her ability to adapt to changing tactical situations while managing significant aircraft battle damage demonstrates the highest levels of pilot skill and mission effectiveness." Thompson raised his hand, his expression skeptical. "Question about the intelligence package. How do we go from light enemy patrol to major staging area without somebody noticing a significant intelligence failure?" The room fell silent for a moment, and Thompson could feel the weight of disapproving stares from around the briefing room. His question had touched on something that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to say out loud. If the intelligence had been that wrong, what did it say about their preparation for future missions? Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, who had been observing the briefing from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Major Thompson raises a valid point," he said carefully. "The intelligence discrepancy is being investigated at the highest levels. What's important for this discussion is understanding how Captain Castellanos managed to achieve such decisive results under difficult circumstances." "With respect, sir," Thompson continued, "I'm not questioning the results. I'm questioning the narrative. Yes, she brought home a damaged airplane. Yes, she apparently destroyed some enemy assets. But are we maybe making this out to be bigger than it actually was?" The room's atmosphere grew noticeably cooler. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Peterson's expression hardened slightly. Thompson had just committed one of the cardinal sins of military culture, questioning the heroic narrative of a fellow pilot's combat performance. Captain Williams, one of the more experienced A-10 pilots in the squadron, turned in his seat to face Thompson directly. "Major, have you actually seen the battle damage assessment on Viper 7? "I've seen the photos," Thompson replied defensively. "Then you know that aircraft should have been unflyable," Williams continued, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You know that Captain Castellanos managed to maintain control of a machine that had sustained catastrophic damage, execute combat operations against a superior enemy force, and bring